for integrating the approaches. So this actually is a little bit different than what I'm used to presenting. This is not an empirical piece of research, but rather it's based on a review article that I wrote, adjusting to these COVID times where we're stuck in our houses and can't go to the field. And so this is something that I posted recently on SciArchive. So you can actually, if I don't do a perfect job of citing, I do a better job in the preprint. I'd suggest going there. It probably gives a more complete account than I'll be able to do here about my ideas. So I also wanted to say that I got some feedback on the early drafts from my PhD supervisor and human behavioral ecologist, Professor Eric Smith, and one of my colleagues here in Australia in Canberra at a neighboring institution, University of Canberra, Phil Kavanagh, who's an evolutionary psychologist. And so this paper has already been submitted also for publication, and I'm currently working on the revise and resubmit. And I must say that it's looking good so far. It's about like this. I'm incorporating my reviewers' feedback. So it's looking a lot like this car. So my apologies. I'm still working on trying to get it all perfectly cohesive, but I'll do my best. So Pairbonding is a near ubiquitous feature of human mating systems that arguably has had immense consequences in shaping human anatomy, physiology, behavior, and society. So these three paradigms have been compared previously by my PhD supervisor, Eric Smith, in what he called the 3 styles framework. And so I'm going to be using that as sort of a framing device. And I wanted to point out that while I'm doing this presentation, which will cover what the 3 styles framework is, how pairbonding is looked at through these 3 lenses, and how some potential pathways, or at least pathways that have already been explored for integrating these styles. I wanted to point out that I'm not going to actually explain, although it is a secondary goal of these paradigms for studying human behavior. I'm not going to try to explain the history of pairbonding in humans. I mean, ideally, these approaches inform that endeavor. But what evolutionary psychology, human behavioral ecology, and dual inheritance theory try to do is explain pairbonding and pairbonding-related behavior in living people. So this is actually borrowed from the original paper by Eric Smith. You can see it cited here below, but essentially contrasting and comparing the 3 styles. So what you can see, this is highlighting the differences between them. Everything from what they try to explain to the key constraints that they look at in their research, how they view the the temporal scale of adaptive change, current adaptiveness of human behavior, whether it's believed that evolutionary theory suggests that we should behave very adaptively currently, or whether we should be behaving maladaptively because we live in such different environments. These approaches differ in that. They also differ in sort of the source of their hypothesis derivation. So everything ranging from sort of informal inference to formal mathematical models. So what I've done in my review is I've talked about these 3 styles, but then picked 3 exemplary questions that have been focused on by practitioners of these styles. So you can see for human behavioral ecology, when will a woman marry an already married man? What ecological factors are associated with Pairbond stability? For evolutionary psychology, a lot of focus on differences between short and long-term mating preferences, and whether sex differences and jealousy reflect our evolutionary history as a pairbonding species. Dual inheritance theory, which is more of a cultural evolutionary approach. What cultural factors have led to the primacy of monogamy in Western societies? And can cultural evolutionary factors lead to variation in the normal pattern of pairbonding? So my paper essentially covers a lot of ground. And so I'm going to only be able to give you sort of a selective view of that. But essentially what I do by looking at these questions, I hope to show that not only are these styles or paradigms differ in the way they approach the study of human behavior, but they're different in the sorts of things that they see as important, pair bonding related behaviors that they think are important and have spent a lot of time trying to explain. So we'll start with human behavioral ecology. This is, as Cyril said, this is the area of evolutionary social sciences that I'm the most familiar with. It's the area that I work in, although I do try to work collaboratively with people in the other areas, which is something that I'll talk about towards the end when I talk about integrating the approaches. But yeah, again, behavioral ecologists are interested in explaining behavioral strategies, and essentially human behavioral ecology views behavioral strategies as shaped by natural selection in ways that will lead to the maximization of inclusive fitness, given the constraints of the physical and social environment. So the key constraints are ecological and in many societies, material also. The approach maintains agnosticism about the mechanisms that produce behavior. So you can see next to it, evolutionary psychology is very preoccupied with the mechanisms that produce behavior and their evolution. Human behavioral ecology actually sort of looks at the behaviors themselves and doesn't worry about the mechanisms, with the understanding that there's obviously a genetic component, a cultural component, and environmental and other environmental components to how we behave. It believes that we are able to agilely adjust our behavior to varying socio-ecological conditions. Practitioners of human behavioral ecology use optimality models to derive predictions. At their most basic, these models take the form of, in context X, do alpha, in context Y, switch to beta, because this is how you would maximize inclusive fitness. So we've evolved these sort of contingent strategies. Human behavioral ecology is viewed as the three styles approach that strikes the best balance between theoretical sophistication and rich empirical application. So looking at some of the stuff that's been done in terms of these two questions. So one area, as I said, was under what conditions are pair bonds stable and when are they unstable? And so mate desertion theory and this model of mate desertion, which is essentially derived from some of the early game theoretic work of John Maynard Smith, the evolutionary biologist. Essentially, this is sort of a schematic and stylized view of it. You can see here three different charts. In the first one, you can see that, so V1 in all of the charts is the fitness that one gets for staying in a pair bond, because of the benefits are increases in offspring survival. The costs actually would be, so it looks at the trade-off between that benefit of staying in a pair bond, the fitness benefit to keeping offspring alive, and the cost would be lost opportunities to find additional mates and increase fitness that way. So this is the fitness or this is the offspring survival when you have one parent providing care or when you have two. You can see that in this first scenario, even if you add on so even if you take the first parent, and so you only get the fitness for one and the other parent focuses on mating, so the payoff is M1. It never is better than two parents providing it, so for either parent. And so in that case, you get no desertion or biparental care. In this scenario, you can see that the fitness, when one parent leaves the pair bond and spends the energy on mating, so then you can add the benefit of mating. It actually crosses the fitness function for biparental care at time one. So that's when you'd expect for the pair bond to end, or at least that individual to leave it. The second parent then, so if the second parent left, then you'd have the fitness of the offspring survival with no parents plus that individual's mating, and it never crosses the V1. So that parent stays. So this is one parent deserts uniparental care. In this situation, same as the last one, the first parent leaves at time one. The second parent, though, it's even with the fitness of having no parent there in terms of offspring survival plus its mating payment in terms of fitness, it crosses here. So the other parent would leave here. So in this case, you would have both parents deserting. So it's essentially a fitness-based model of when parents would desert and when they wouldn't. And this is, again, just a stylized version of it. It's been tested empirically. So for instance, one empirical test looked at South American and African foragers. The potential for larger payoffs to mating effort, fertility units per male, or FU per male, was associated with lower Pairbond stability. So you can see here that, but also that higher values for an index of fathering and mating trade-offs were associated with higher Pairbond stability. So their argument was that, at least in these foraging societies, the mating side was probably a stronger driver of Pairbond stability than the offspring survival part of it. And again, I don't want to go into too much detail about each individual thing. The paper goes into much more detail. I can say, though, that so other sort of tests in human behavioral ecology looking at similar hypotheses, but using different sorts of data sources. So this one is the standard cross-cultural sample. It's an existing cross-cultural database. You can see all the societies that are represented in it. So Quinlan and Quinlan found that a few things. One, that some of the models are probably a little bit simplistic because you can also get increases in offspring survival from grandparents helping out instead of the second parent and that sort of stuff. So helpers can increase fitness as much as fathers can, and so you get when a society relies heavily on helpers to the parents, like an older sibling or a grandparent or something, then pair bonds are usually more unstable. But also you can see here there's this curvilinear relationship when you look at relative male contribution to subsistence, where pair bonds are unstable when males aren't providing anything because they're sort of unnecessary, the males, but also that sometimes when the males are doing all of the work, they use that as sort of a showing off to attract additional mates. So the highest pair bond stability would be was found to be in societies where there's sort of an equal contribution of males and females. There's complementarity in subsistence work. Again, talk about more in the paper. The other question was, from a behavioral ecology perspective, was when would a woman decide to marry with an already married man rather than a man who doesn't have a wife? And so the Polygyny Threshold Model, again, another model that was sort of built in the evolutionary sort of animal behavior literature. This is a model whereby females assess male wealth or resources and choose to mate with a male that will provide them with the largest share of fitness enhancing resources, even if it means sharing those resources with other females. And so this graphical representation over here to the side is a version of the original from Gordon Orions, who made his name for a number of things, but studying blackbirds in the United States. But that's a polygynous species, and this model provided a good explanation for the decisions that the female birds are making. But it's also been looked at for people. So essentially, it assumes female reproductive success is a function of male wealth or territory quality, which differs if the female is mating with a mated or unmated male. So you can see there are two functions here, one for the male that's unmated and one who's already mated. So there's another female is looking at this or has evolved to look at it in ways that to make decisions that would maximize her fitness. So the polygyny threshold is T. The costs for becoming a second wife is C. So that just has to do with the shape of these functions. So again, this is just an exemplary one. But what you can do is you can compare. So in this, we consider a female who are deciding whether to mate monogamously with male one. So that's this dot here, or polygynously with this one. You can see that she will choose male one because the fitness of this one doesn't cross that polygyny threshold T. But if you're comparing mating polygynously with one, or sorry, monogamously with one, or polygynously or becoming the second wife of male 3, this one is above the polygyny threshold. So in this case, she would, because of the increase in male territory quality, maximize her fitness by becoming a second wife of that male. And so, again, human behavioral ecologists use these models to derive predictions. Monique Borgerhoff-Mulder, who's sort of one of the early pioneers, along with Eric Smith of human behavioral ecology. She did a study for her PhD in the, I believe it was the early 80s or mid 80s, amongst the Kipsigis, a pastoralist society from Kenya. And she basically found that the predictions of the polygyny threshold model were borne out, that the size of the land holdings that the men had was associated with the number of wives, and that was controlling for a sequence of accumulation of wives and land holdings. But she also was able to demonstrate there was a cost to polygyny. A more recent study by Ross and colleagues looked at this cross-culturally in 19 societies. This is a little bit different than the other cross-cultural study I talked about. That other one was mining existing ethnographic materials for data. So that's what the standard cross-cultural sample is, and then you can use it to test hypotheses. The study by Ross was a collection of researchers who were working at field sites around the world. You can see them here, collecting equivalent data to be used to test hypotheses. So they conducted their study to address the paradox of the prevalence of exclusive pairbonding or monogamy in agricultural societies, despite the relatively high levels of material wealth inequality, because one of the predictions of the polygyny threshold model would be that when there's more wealth inequality, you will get more polygyny, or at least some males would. So what they did was they found some of the shortcomings of the original polygyny threshold model. One, that it was just based on female choice, and unfortunately that's not always the way it works in every human society. And so they did it with mutual mate choice logic, where both males and females have an input. They also moved away from the sort of simple logic of all wealth sort of being this depletable wealth, because some wealth can be used for multiple things, like the knowledge that you acquire, for instance, is a type of wealth, but you don't have to spend it. You can use it on multiple things. It's not depletable like money or land. And basically they found in these societies that agriculturalists have more inequality than non-agriculturalists, but fewer individuals that cross the polygyny threshold, which might be one of the reasons why males rarely engage in, or there's rarely polygynous marriage. But also they found diminishing returns to polygyny for wealthy men who might have been predicted to procure additional wives. So essentially, quite quantitatively complex study, I would say, but essentially showing that the polygyny threshold model at its base is pretty good, but it needs a few modifications probably to explain the decisions of people, behavior of people in cross-culturally. So again, I don't want to, I'm probably going into too much detail about each individual study, so my apologies. I might not do that. I might not continue doing that given the time. But the paper definitely is gives you a little bit more flavor. So I'll move to evolutionary psychology. This is where, evolutionary psychologists look at psychological mechanisms. The temporal scale of adaptive changes is long-term, genetic. They actually predict that human behavior will be not adaptive in many cases in the modern world because our environments change so much and there's adaptive lag. One of the key differences between behavioral ecology and evolutionary psychology is that the hypotheses are derived in evolutionary psychology based on informal inference. What would have been adaptive in the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness? So agricultural people, which is quite a large time period, right? So we've only been doing agriculture for 5 or 10% of our existence. So evolutionary psychology looked to our time as hunter-gatherers or foragers and what would have been adaptive there, and our brains should basically be working in ways that would have been adaptive there. So they've had the questions that they focus a lot of energy on related to pair bonding are how are long and short-term mating preferences comparing, and do sex differences in jealousy reflect our evolutionary history as a pair bonded species. So this is an adapted chart from Buss and Schmidt. So they were the ones that first pointed out that it would have been adaptive to have different mating strategies if you were going for short-term mates versus long-term. And these were sort of the adaptive problems that they identified even 30 years ago. And since that time, a lot of work has been done. And one of the sort of things that is important is that, again, these are adaptive problems. So evolutionary psychologists do a lot of work sort of testing hypotheses with, I think they're doing a good job these days of sort of moving beyond just using, university samples. But a lot of the early stuff in this was using university samples, little experiments that they would run to with students. But I think that they've sort of gone beyond that. Yeah, so for instance, it's important that they test hypotheses about current mate preferences based on these hypothesized past selective pressures. So one study looked at 561 university studies and found that internal qualities such as having socially appealing and similar personality were more important for long-term mating than they were for short-term, but external characteristics such as physical attractiveness were more important for short-term mating. Another study with university students found that preferences in short-term and long-term mating, actual preferences, could be grouped into 3 clusters of physical attractiveness, interpersonal warmth, and social status. And all of them were important for both long-term mating and short-term mating, but attractiveness, again, was more important than short-term mating, and warmth was more important for long-term mating. So there are these differences. So this is one of the areas that evolutionary psychologists like to look at and have spent a lot of energy on. So I'm just giving you sort of this, brushing the surface of it. Another is looking at jealousy and paternity certainty. So Buss again, so David Buss, the evolutionary psychologist from the University of Texas, provided an early and succinct explication of the logic of male sexual jealousy as a means for maximizing paternity, but the idea that there should also be a sex difference such that females would also feel jealousy, but in response to emotional infidelity. And the argument was based on fitness maximization in the ancestral past. There have been criticisms of this. Probably evolutionary psychology gets the most criticism. Some of it probably is a bit warranted. Others, I'm sympathetic to it because I think that in some cases the assumptions that they make probably are realistic. I mean, the idea that we have bodies that aren't very well adapted to today and leads to sickness is one of the key, one of the cornerstones of evolutionary medicine. So it's not clear to me why that's so difficult for some people to swallow when it comes to human behavior also, that in some cases we may not behave adaptively because we're in such a different environment than the one we evolved to, but not for everything. So despite criticisms, a meta-analysis, it's a little bit small, but just to show that there's quite a few studies looking at 209 effect sizes and 47 independent samples found that overall the sex differences manifest across response types and whether the participants were reacting to real or hypothetical infidelity. Again, the sex difference where males get more of a sort of physiological and behavioral response to sexual infidelity and females to emotional, where somebody like actually doesn't have to be sexual, just sort of spending energy and time and resources on somebody else. Also, the reason that I show here Leontes, the King of Sicily from Shakespeare's The Winter Play, is that there's actually been some attention from evolutionary psychologists looking at the reflection of these sort of aspects of human nature and these evolved tendencies in themes in literature, and that seems to be one that recurs, the male sexual jealousy and the female emotional infidelity. Yeah, so I'll keep moving on in the interest of time. This is actually a study that I was involved in. So my colleague and actually friend as a PhD student, Brooke Shelza, who's pictured there with some Himba men, wanted to run this experiment that Buss had been and other evolutionary psychologists had been running in a lot of sort of Western college samples, and a limited range of non-Western samples also, or non-weird, I guess they call it, Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic. So I won't, but so we basically ran the same experiment in a bunch of sort of small scale societies. So I did the one in Indonesia amongst the group that I studied there, the Karo. She worked with the Himba. I think she probably also got the Los Angeles sample also. But the nice thing is that we were able to show that, yes, the sex difference in the type of jealousy that people feel stood up in these societies, but the degree to which males felt jealous in response to sexual infidelity was actually modulated by how important the male is to providing care to offspring in these societies, because there was a bit of variation, and that explained quite a bit of the variance in the male's jealous response. So a nice overlap between sort of a behavioral ecology and evolutionary psychology approach, which I'll come back to at the end. So the last of the three styles framework, or the last of the three styles in the three styles framework, is dual inheritance theory. This is views cultural evolutionary and co-evolutionary, meaning biology and culture. So evolutionary and co-evolutionary forces, it views them as the primary drivers of human behavioral variation. Cultural evolution is conceptualized in changes in norms and values caused by standard evolutionary mechanisms, such as natural selection and other forces that are unique to cultural systems, such as forms of social learning and bias, and the biases in the transmission of culture. Culture is viewed as more flexible than biology in driving adaptation to novel or rapidly changing environments, but at the same time, it can be rather inflexible due to structural and informational related constraints. So this is the current adaptiveness. Dual inheritance theory is sort of in between evolutionary psychology and human behavior in terms of how adaptive it thinks that human behavior will be in the modern day. So yeah, it really depends on how the culture that drives the behavior is transmitted and from whom. And so dual inheritance theory can focus on cultural microevolution. It's probably its main focus. So, but also can look at sort of broader macroevolutionary, cultural evolutionary patterns. And that's a sort of an emerging area. I mean, not in the last couple of years, but in the last 10 years or 15 years, maybe 20. People have been using cultural phylogenetics to look at explaining the presence of norms in various societies. So I'll talk about some examples of that. And of these approaches, dual inheritance theory is thought to be the approach that has the most sophisticated theoretical modeling, but it's relatively lagging in empirical application, though it has recently begun to make up ground on this front, as I said. So one question that dual inheritance theory people ask is, why is monogamy so prevalent in the West? It's a society where you would expect for males to take advantage of the, like we said before, the inequality in wealth and the ability to accumulate wealth and turning that into additional mating opportunities and additional wives, if you're thinking of it strictly from an adaptive perspective. So why have these societies mostly been monogamous? And so the current dominance of social norms in or socially imposed monogamy in Western societies is often traced back to early Greco-Roman civilization, which gave rise to European medieval monogamy, reinforced by the Christian Church and spread via conversion, colonialism, and other mechanisms. One cultural evolutionary study using a global cross-cultural data set found that cultural evolutionary history explains slightly more variance in marriage norms than does socioecology. Fortunato, who's cited there, used similar cultural phylogenetic methods to reconstruct the history of marriage systems in Indo-European societies. And one of her conclusions was that, again, there's quite a bit of phylogenetic signal, you would call it, in monogamy, but she also, when she reconstructed the ancestral Indo-European society, she basically found a high probability that it was also monogamous. so that it may have emerged earlier than Greco-Roman society as being the primary one. Yeah, so the origin of norms for socially imposed monogamy has been the subject of much debate. Why would elite males keep one wife when successful males in most small-scale societies have many? So socially imposed monogamy seen in ancient Roman society was characterized by Betzig as marriage was monogamous and mating was polygynous. So elites had one wife, but many concubines and no restriction on mating with slaves, which was similar to other early civilizations. So she's done quite a bit of historical research on that. So that's one area so this is one area. I also talk quite a bit about another study by Henrik, which is sort of a very sweeping theory about the cultural evolution of monogamy in the West in my paper. I think it was published in 2012. And I cut it out because of time. But I mention it a little bit later, but it's essentially associated with this kind of stuff. But it uses something that's a little bit contentious in evolutionary studies, regardless of actually probably in evolutionary psychology and behavioral ecology, group selection sort of arguments are a bit of anathema. And they've been disfavored for 40 years or 50 years or maybe even 60. But they're making a bit of a resurgence, especially cultural group selection ideas. And so Henrik's sort of paper is based in that. And that's one of those areas that's sort of a sticking point when we talk about how these things can be combined into sort of a useful amalgamated theory or framework for studying human behavior, is that what do we do about group selection? Because most evolutionary theorists don't want to go near it. But anyway, so dual inheritance theorists also look at some variations, so cultural evolution of variations on the near universal pattern that you see in people. So the Mizuo, for instance, are a matrilineal society from Yunnan, China, who practice a unique reproductive strategy called walking marriage, whereby males and females remain in their native home and males visit females, and marriage is non-normative. Some have pointed to paternity uncertainty and the matrilineal transmission of wealth, such as agricultural land, as the driving factor in the cultural evolution of this pattern, but others have suggested that other factors such as communal breeding are more important. So I talk a bit about those debates in the paper. Nonetheless, despite the rather unusual norms, the Mizuo tend to form lasting relationships and form couples akin to marriages, even though the cultural system is sort of against it. The Onedo colony, the picture is there, but I'll skip it for the presentation, but it's a similar example to the Mizuo. The Mahinaku are an example from Brazil, a South American Indian or native society. They're one of a cluster of so-called partible paternity societies that you find in South America. Partible paternity is the belief that pregnancies require a contribution from multiple men, each who share a portion of the child's paternity. And so one example of dual inheritance theory thinking, I won't try to walk you through the logic of the mathematical model, but essentially Masudi and Leyland built a agent-based coevolutionary model with a simplified genetic structure, just 2 genes and cultural dynamics, which you do when you do modeling, because you want to have a system that you can actually, that's mathematically and tractable, but it's often simplified, but that's agreed to be okay in modeling. But they showed that populations could evolve one of 2 strategies under their model, one with singular paternity and one with partible paternity with polygyny. And this suggests the thing that would make societies lead towards the partible paternity sort of a norm would be female biased sex ratios due to high male mortality. And they actually show in their simulations that could have led to the cluster of partible paternity societies that you see in South America today. So again, I'm being very selective here and just trying to give a flavor, the sorts of questions that are asked in these 3 paradigms, or these three styles in the evolutionary study of human behavior. I actually haven't, I want to be clear that I haven't proposed anything new. I basically went in the literature and found examples of where people had, because there's been lots of calls for sort of integrating these paradigms. So I looked at the sort of what were the proposals for doing so, and I came up with three. And so why integrate in the first place? Well, there's a lot of history of integrating theories. The modern synthesis was an integration of Darwin and Mendel's theory. Even more recently, the extended evolutionary synthesis is sort of a amalgamation of standard evolutionary thinking with thinking about how non-genetic influences work in biology. But so essentially, the first one that I found was what I called subsumption. So subsumption privileges the vast overlap amongst the three styles, focuses on the same thing, things like the focus on the same single species, their evolutionary orientation, a shared desire to apply a unified theoretical approach rather than the sort of hodgepodge you see in normal social science. In essence, it ceases to recognize the three styles as distinct and incorporates them all under one umbrella. So one proposal to do that was by Daly and Wilson, evolutionary psychologists. They basically said that all of these things could just be called evolutionary psychology. So we can just forget that there ever was a HPE or a DIT and just call all of it evolutionary psychology. It wasn't taken very well by other practitioners in the other areas. For one, probably because of precedence, but also because of there's differences, like I'm showing in the assumptions and differences in the things that are considered important. There's also things like the sticking points, such as whether behavior or the mechanisms that produce behavior are what are evolving, whether it's useful to measure the fitness consequences of modern humans' behavior, whether it's useful or relevant, how culture fits into the picture, whether group selection is a viable evolutionary force. So this is not probably going to be the way it goes, even though it's been proposed. Another potential is bricolage. And bricolage, as argued by Leyland and Brown, is the integration that leverages the expertise. They didn't call it bricolage. I borrowed that from Anthropology and Claude Lévi-Strauss. But he argued that, Leyland and Brown argued that an integration would leverage the expertise of researchers themselves who are best positioned to choose the right approach or combination of approaches for the problem at hand, far from wishing to establish, so this is quoting them, far from wishing to establish or reinforce artificial frontiers, we would like to encourage the evolutionary minded to move selectively between schools, picking and choosing the best tools available, drawing insights from each, and synthesizing divergent perspectives in a critical and discerning manner. The contemporary evolutionist is not bound to any one of the approaches and is free to draw from the methods available across the broader field of evolutionary behavioral sciences. There have been many examples of this sort of integration. So evolutionary psychology and human behavioral ecology are often closely tied. So I already discussed the study that I was involved in of the modulation of jealousy based on how important paternal care is. That sort of uses both sort of evolutionary psychology and behavioral ecology thinking. There's another paper that was written by Conroy Beam and David Buss and colleagues using sort of formal game theory modeling, which is normally something that behavioral ecologists do, but they were coming from an evolutionary psychology perspective. The paper that I talked about with Henrik, it's a dual inheritance theory sort of thing, talking about the cultural evolution of monogamy norms in the West and how they would have emerged and how they would stick around, even in the face of sort of a lot of sort of pull towards males being able to find additional mates. Obviously, it has their arguments have cultural elements, but it also has sort of evolutionary psychology, sort of evolved mechanisms in the brain that influence the way culture is transmitted, because culture we think of as this thing that's sort of non-biological, but the mechanisms, the brain that stores the information, the way we transmit it, the biases we have, and what sort of things that we find relevant when we learn them is probably inherited, or sorry, it's probably has sort of a genetic component to it. And so that's sort of key to their argument. So it's sort of combining sort of evolutionary psychology and dual inheritance theory thinking. Another way that I prefer, I think this is a good way that we might integrate it, would be to have people from the different fields collaborating on projects, and that's something that I've done quite a bit. So the last one is a lattice work. So on top, so the lattice work would be taking the three styles and then integrating them with some other theory. So one example that I found in the literature was Tinbergen's 4 Whys, sort of looking at the 4 different types of explanations: functional or fitness related ones, evolutionary history or phylogeny related ones, mechanism related ones having to do with, you know, the brain or with the endocrine system, what sort of drives behavior, and then ontogeny, or the development of behavior. So this was in Brown, Dickens, Sears, and Leyland. They talked about the focuses of these 3 styles, look at those things. And I think there's something in this, although I think that all of them, you might be able to put a check in all of these. So these are the checks that Brown, Dickens, Sears, and Leyland put in. So I'm just illustrating what they did. It's my illustration, but I'm translating their text into an illustration. But you could probably put like a sort of faded X in some of in the other boxes also. But I think there's something to the lattice work. So ontogeny is deeply ingrained in the cultural centric dual inheritance theory approach, but only sometimes considered in others. And one of the benefits is that it could be incorporated in a more systematic way. Asking how pair bonds develop over a lifetime is an approximate non-evolutionary question. Nonetheless, developmental aspects of pair bonding can shape and be shaped by evolutionary processes. And this is something that I think I saw Adam's name there in the audience here today, but a PhD student here at the ANU and myself wrote a nice review paper looking on one mechanism that drives pair bonding, or is related to pair bonding, romantic love, and looked at it from these sorts of perspectives. And so, and my own research amongst the Karo people, so illustrated here, this picture, it was taken way before I started doing research, but I just kind of like it, illustrates how culture can influence the development of love in a pair bond. Amongst the Karo of Indonesia, marriage to one's matrilateral cross cousin, or impal, is preferred, but nowadays rare. In my study of 176 marriages in 662 villages, the proportion of marriages that were arranged was substantially higher amongst impal versus non-impal marriages, so you can see that here. It was quite interesting to study this phenomenon. Got some rich ethnographic data. It was interesting to hear a story from one elderly couple who had been in love for 50 years, but they told me how it started very differently. When she found, her parents told her she was marrying her cousin, she ran away at 16 years old. Her parents found her and they hog-tied her basically so that she couldn't run away again. And normally my alarms would be raised, but they look to be pretty happy now. And but anyway, my point is that this is so arranged marriage is a very culturally sort of driven aspect of the way we pair bond. But an arranged marriage actually was identified by Fletcher et al. As a potential stumbling block for the evolution of love as a pair bonding mechanism. And also phylogenetic analysis by Walker et al. Suggested that arranged marriages have been around since at least the time of Homo sapiens' first foray out of Africa. And so again, just using this as sort of an illustration that if we're going to fully understand pair bonding from I think the lattice work allows us to sort of integrate these sort of ontogenetic, evolutionary history, all of them together into a coherent story. Yeah, I mean, even if romantic love's not the initial impetus for marriage, it can still function to maintain a bond. So, yeah, so, I mean, that's essentially what my paper covers. Again, I realize that I'm trying to cover in 45 minutes here a lot, and I apologize if it wasn't fully clear. Hopefully it was, but I'm happy to take questions if I can clarify anything.
All right, thank you so much, Geoff. That was fascinating. I guess trying to reconcile those different paradigms is quite a formidable task.
Yes.
Are there any questions for Geoff? Maybe I can start with one. You mentioned dual inheritance theory or cultural evolution, and I'm quite intrigued by this line of reasoning. But it makes sense to me that cultural monogamy is beneficial for the functioning of society, but I still don't quite understand how it could be adaptive for a wealthy or a powerful man to not realize his mating potential.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile these two different, ways of seeing things?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's one of the important questions that cultural evolutionary dual inheritance theory people ask, and probably I think that the explanation that's probably the one that's the most accepted and acknowledged, although again people argue because it's based in group selection theory, is that they're essentially these norms that are imposed based, and you basically, Henrik was basically, so he's an anthropologist at Harvard. He basically showed that when people aren't monogamous, you basically get uprisings of the males that are sort of left out of the mating game, and so then it can actually, through cultural group selection, can actually become the thing that the male does, even though it's not in his best fitness interest, because of the high costs in terms of like social disarray. And most evolutionary theorists would say, well, that wouldn't be enough, right? That's group selection theory thinking. The individual male is going to want to do whatever he has to do to maximize his fitness, or will evolve to do that. But I mean, their argument is pretty good about why cultural group selection could lead to this sort of stuff because of the sort of social disarray. I mean, they talk about everything from like decreased fertility that ensues from it, higher crime rates, and all sorts of stuff. It's sort of it's a very sweeping theory, the Henrik et al. 2012 article. I think that I didn't even cite it there, but it's in the preprint.
So that's the puzzle of monogamous marriage, right? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I've read that one.
And so that's probably the best answer to that question.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Geoff? You can also use the chat if you prefer. So far, I haven't seen any hands up. If you don't mind, I'll ask another question.
I don't mind.
So I understand that your paper is concerned with the current state of affairs, but I'm still wondering, what we can learn from non-human primates about the evolution of pair bonding or monogamy in humans. And there's one model that's been proposed to explain the evolution of pair bonding in non-human primates, and that's the bodyguard model. So essentially that pair bond is a form of protection against infanticide or sexual coercion. Yeah. Can this model be applied to humans as well?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think it could be potentially one of the things that would have led to the sort of mating systems you see in ancestral humans. The nice thing about non-human primates is you have such a wide variety of living species to include in the phylogenetic analyses. The problem with humans is that we're the only hominin species still around. So we can sort of try to reconstruct, what, say, an earlier genus Homo species would have done, maybe an Australopithecus species would have done. But in the end, it's somewhat speculative. So there's less work done in it, but there's plenty of speculation. I have seen some writing about the bodyguard model as potential explanation of why when and why humans would have evolved monogamy. There's been lots of sort of speculation, but again, I don't think that you can pinpoint evidence like you can for the non-human primates as strongly in human evolution as you can for non-primate evolution, just because of that absence of closely related species. Because Yeah, I mean, we can basically say with certainty what's the difference between the behavior of a chimpanzee and a human, and then we can use that to reconstruct. But let's be honest, we can try to reconstruct the behavior of, say, Australopithecus or early genus Homo, but we don't fully know. I mean, people say that, oh, okay, well, you see sexual dimorphism, some degree in Australopithecus, and it has this ramifications for their mating system. But in the end, then you have people say, well, actually, no, there wasn't sexual dimorphism. That was two different species, right? So it's all pretty speculative. Whereas in primates, you have all these living species that you can add to your comparison. And for humans, you don't have that benefit.
Thanks. Is there anyone else who has a question for Geoff?
It's either because I was so clear or I was so unclear that everybody's just like, oh my God, you're confused. But either way, I can answer anything, guys. I'm not as intimidating as I look.
It was a really great summary of all the different, ways of explaining human behavior, and I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much, Geoff.
You're welcome. Yeah, it was fun to put together. I got to delve into literatures that I wasn't like super familiar with, but it was a good way. It was a good sort of a project to take on during COVID times when you could go to the library and look at online resources, but you couldn't go to the field.
I had a question, Cyril, actually. Thanks.
Go ahead.
So I really enjoyed it as well. I was just wondering, what's this sort of evidence, or how strong is the evidence for genetics to be involved in mate choice? I've read some papers about smelling people and all that sort of stuff, and I just sort of wondered what's sort of your take on all those type of studies.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm personally of the opinion that all aspects of human behavior are going to be a mix of a bit of genetic influence and a bit of cultural and other influences. But I mean, even evolutionary psychologists who are sort of accused of saying this is all genetic don't actually say that. So the classic study of David Buss looking at mate choice in like 37 societies, one of his main conclusions was that, yeah, you do see these recurring things in mate choice, but there's this huge cultural component that people find things attractive that are different in every society, even though there is this sort of underlying similarities across them also. So, but that's one thing that's a weakness, I would say, of sort of evolutionary studies of human behavior. Any claims of sort of a genetic component usually are difficult to substantiate. I know that there's this huge field of sort of evolutionary genetics or behavioral genetics, but a lot of people aren't even convinced by those because they're basically looking at correlations and not causation and stuff like that. And so I'm with you that or at least I think I'm with you in that if somebody would make a claim about that, mate choice was genetically determined, I would say no, probably not. But I'm for most things, there's going to be some genetic component, the way into our behavior, even to things like music. I mean, I mean, the music that we listen to and the music that you see in different cultures obviously is culturally determined, but the way we perceive music and what the sorts of things make our mind react in a certain way, I think it would be hard to argue that there wasn't sort of a genetic or biological component to that as well, right? So.
No, that was great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, if there's no further questions, then I would like to thank Geoff again for giving this wonderful seminar today. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks.